Welcome back to the Whispering Hour, where the world sleeps, and stories wake. Before tonight's tale begins, don't forget to like the video, comment where you're watching from, and tell us what kind of stories you would love to hear next. And subscribe, so you'll be here when the next story wakes. Now, let's begin. I never thought the word alive would ever fit a place full of stones. Not until that autumn when the cemetery began to make sounds I could not explain. I'd worked the night shifts for 3 years by then. I knew the rhythm of the place, the gates, the lamp checks, the hush after midnight when the last of the mourners had left and the world narrowed to headstones and the soft scuff of my boots. Night work teaches you a certain patience. It teaches you how to listen for ordinary things, a raccoon in the hedges, the clank of an old sprinkler, the distant hum of a delivery truck. You learn to separate the normal noises from the ones that want your attention. That night it was nearly 11 when I unlocked the south gate and stepped into the cemetery. The gravel crunched underfoot, the lamps cast small islands of weak gold, and the old map by the maintenance shed showed me where I needed to be. My flashlight hung from a strap over my shoulder, my breath puffed in short clouds, and I felt that neutral, steady fatigue that comes from a day stretched long. I checked the shed as I always did, tools in place, locks intact, mower parked where it belonged, then began my round. The weather had been restless that week, a wash of wind in the afternoons, a low drizzle that left the grass heavy. Tonight the air was weirdly still, the leaves didn't even whisper when I passed the larger monuments. The older graves, the ones stamped with dates from the early 1900s, looked like a different species, lean and patient in their mossy coats. There is a weight to old stone that younger markers don't have. It holds the weather differently. It keeps the small noises instead of letting them fly away. I walked past Section D on habit. That was the part of the cemetery most people avoided. The ground there was uneven, the stones architecturally awkward, and the names were carved in an older hand that was beautiful in a way that made you feel obliged to be respectful. I'd learned the names, in a half-joking way, as you learn the faces of the people in your neighborhood: Lewitt, Marlowe, Pennington. You get to know the small details: who had a bronze angel, who had a family photo that never quite looked the same in the morning, who had a small stone with a bird etched on it. It all became part of the job, background companionship. Just past the Lewitt plot, I heard the sound. It was not wind. It was not animal. It came in a slow, deliberate rhythm: metal on soil, exhale, metal on soil again. SHK, SHK, SHK. A human scrape, not the jarring chorus you get from something mechanical or accidental. I stopped mid-step, flashlight steady, and listened. The sound came from inside the older section, low and even, and at first I told myself it was a worker finishing a late landscaping job or perhaps a stray volunteer with good intentions. But who would be digging at 11? The gate was locked. There had not been any event scheduled. The calendar on the shed had a blank square for the night. I lifted my flashlight beam and walked toward the sound. The nearer I got, the clearer the scrape became, and with it a cold kind of anticipation settled into the bones of me. "Hello." I called softly, the cemetery's answer a hush. The scraping stopped. For a second the night held its breath like a room waiting for applause. "Almost finished," someone said. The voice was thin through the stone, close enough to make the hair on my forearm stand up. It sounded like a man's voice, older than it might have been, or perhaps worn down by weather and time. When I moved toward the corner where the sound had come from, the sentence dissolved into the dark. The beam of my flashlight swept over peeling dates and small plastic flowers. There was a fresh pile of dirt at the foot of a headstone, dark and neat, the kind of disturbed soil you expect to see after repairs, not in the middle of a locked night. A shovel lay half buried in that pile, the metal ring catching my light like an accusing eye. My first reasonable thought wanted to file the scene under trespass. People did strange things at night sometimes. Drunks, lovers, kids daring each other. I took out my radio, clicked the switch out of routine, and called the security line. No answer. The dispatcher at the office would usually pick up. She sleeps at odd hours, so I knew she paid attention. Static hissed back at me. I cursed softly and stepped closer. The headstone at the center of the disturbance belonged to Thomas Lewitt, 1871 to 1913, an old name I'd seen every week for months. The carving was worn, but his dates, there in that old serif, always caught me. Someone had started to clear the soil near the base in a tidy rectangle like an intentional excavation. A thin scattering of pebble and root made the disturbed patch look recent, as if the ground were still trying to settle. "Sir," I said. "You can't dig here at night. This ground is cursed for a lot of things, but people sense it even if they don't know why. Put down the shovel and step out." No answer. Just the faint scent of the earth. It was colder there, a temperature that sat under your skin like a reminder. I circled the stone, flashlight cutting a careful arc. No footprints. No sign of a boot print in the damp soil beyond the tight rectangle. It could have been one person with small, careful steps. It could have been nobody at all. The shovel had fallen to rest on the soil as if a hand had unraveled and let it go. The handle was clean, polished from use, while the blade carried the dark of the grave's earth. I reached for it and my fingers hovered. The rational man in me, uniform, radio, sheltering the town, wanted to secure the tool and file a report. The other part of me, the one that had listened to too many late-night stories, told me to wait, to be still. To let whatever was there speak first. That is when the voice changed. The whisper came right behind my ear like a breath. "Help me finish." It was a child's plea wrapped in the cadence of a man. There was no malice. No threat in the words. Just a blunt, aching need. I didn't turn. I could not. There are some moments where motion becomes the worst possible thing you can do, as if the very act of turning your head would be letting something see you. So I stayed frozen and tried to breathe on purpose, counting a practical sequence in my head, 1, 2, 3, because counting is faith's practical cousin. The earth under the shovel bulged. Small, precise, like a fist pushing up from below. It was not the subtle shift of settling ground. It was force, a deliberate press. I felt it in my knees and then in my chest. The light of my flashlight reflected on a shape beneath the dirt, not shaped yet, only a suggestion, a negative space as if something were pressing its palm against fabric from the other side. I stumbled back and the beam of my flashlight skittered. The sound of scraping, the slow, patient shovel rhythm, resumed at my feet, but this time the cadence changed, more urgent. It encircled me, moved around the monument, and I realized with a cold certainty that the digging sound was not anchored to a single place. It traveled, close and then far, as if it was searching. I ran. Not through the hedges or the labyrinth of names, but straight to the gate. My legs cut the gravel into rhythm, the flashlight banging at the side of my knee. I burst through the gate and collapsed on the outer sidewalk, hands splayed against the cold metal of the fence. The night air outside felt like oxygen returned. The lawn lamps looked like polite sentries watching a domestic disturbance they did not comprehend. Inside the cemetery, sound melted back into ordinary night noises, the distant road, a dog barking twice and falling silent. I called it in then, with a voice that put together the facts like a man doing inventory: disturbed soil, a shovel present, no sign of who had done the work. The dispatcher promised a patrol would check within 30 minutes. She asked standard questions: had I touched the shovel, did I see footprints, was anyone nearby, and I gave her the honest catalogue of my fear and method and certainty. She suggested maybe an animal, maybe a trick of wind, and I listened because she had no reason to lie. She said she would send someone. That settled the immediate bureaucracy into motion and did little for the pressure in my ribs. I went back for another sweep, because habit and stubbornness beat fear for me. The dirt where Lewitt's grave had been looked marginally more disturbed, as if more had been worked overnight. A thin line of soil kissed the foot of an adjacent stone. I touched it. Cold, yes, an old, wet cold, but not like ice. It felt like a memory. At the head of the small trench someone had left a scrap of paper, a folded rectangle half hidden against the grass, darkened by dew. I unfolded it with a finger and watched my breath fog the small handwriting inside. The words were short, "Finish. Please." I brought the scrap to my radio and asked for confirmation on missing persons from the early records, old families who used this ground. "We have calls here," an old complaint about grave markers moving, a record of a man in the 1930s who'd been found unconscious near the gate, a child's toy reported lost and never returned. The history here accumulates like sediment. That scrap did not, on paper at least, match any official report. That night the patrol came, slow and efficient, and we walked the rows with flashlights like schoolboys making late-night mischief of discovery. They found nothing tangible beyond the light impressions and the scrap. No tire marks. No footprints that told a story. The shovel had disappeared. The soil, where one would have expected more obvious signs of human interference, seemed oddly tended, as if hands had planted it back under a cover that smoothed over the evidence. The officer asked me for statements, took my name, and then offered a version of the kind of advice a town gives in the face of oddness: sleep, keep watch, call us if anything else occurs. I did not sleep. I spent the hours until dawn patrolling in a rigid loop. The cemetery took on a series of small theatrical moments: a fox crossing the path, a pair of headlights in the distance, the lamps shifting from dark to color with the slow approach of day. At dawn I found the fresh soil again, the outline of a small hole, and at the foot of the headstone, placed neatly as if by ritual, a child's marble. Clean white, round, warm from the sun that was new. No tracks. No fingerprints. The marble sat like impeachment on the terms of the place. When I held it, the memory rushed forward, an image I'd not known I had, a boy with bright hair, laughing in the sunlight by the river, a hand that let go of the marble and never reached back. These things you think you are remembering for the first time are often the sediment of a place we've listened to for so long that it confesses details to us slowly. I have since learned to be wary of the word coincidence around cemeteries. Word got around in the small town, they always do, and some folks came to argue with logic. They brought flashlights, dictionaries of rational explanation, jokes that were attempts at comfort. Others left flowers or token remembrances. No one did any digging during the day. If anyone tried, the morning sun seemed to dissolve the impulse into curiosity and then into chairs and coffee. Yet at night, the little marks continued to appear, small mounds, a shifted ribbon, a shoe left at the foot of a name. Each one felt like a message written badly in the language of regret. We tried to close the story with procedure. We set motion cameras on poles, we dug deeper into the records, we reached out to an antiquarian who loved headstones and their provenance. The cameras gave us nothing but artifact, a strip of night-lifted footage where the sensor caught a wash of pale light, no shape that could be identified, just a brightness on the grass that looked like a handprint of sun in the dark. The records gave us the family lines and small tragedies: tuberculosis, accidents, a warehouse fire. The antiquarian stroked a particular corner of Lewitt stone and explained, in the way of men who catalog grief, that some graves get sticky for reasons a man of stone can't voice, old soils that hold more than bone. The nights went like that: attention, observation, the keen desire to look away. The scraping came again and again. Sometimes it circled for an hour, sometimes it left only a single soft whispering. Once, I stood guard for 4 hours under a lamppost and watched the light scatter on the grass like coins, until the scraping started right beside me and I felt the earth press in time with my heartbeat. That night I didn't run. I put my shovel, my personal tool, heavy and useful, into the disturbed dirt, and for a long minute allowed it to be a bridge between the world of live hands and whatever was trying to be finished under the surface. The voice came then like a name that had been waiting to be called. Not loud, never a shout. "Finish," it said, and this time there was an image attached, a body wrapped in a jacket and water, a child's glint of laughter, a man who had been sorry and never said so properly. I knelt and began to dig with my hands, not because I knew how to write things, but because the motion was simple and human. The soil gave under my fingers and it smelled of river and rain and time. I uncovered nothing human. I uncovered a small tin box, rusted shut but light enough to hold in 2 hands. Inside, folded thin and soft, were scraps of paper and a photograph, sepia and tiny, a family that smiled without knowing how the years would turn. The box had been tucked like a promise. I lifted it and in my head the idea came unbidden, maybe the grave needed an allowance, maybe a memory wanted proof of being held. After that night, the scraping lessened. Not vanished, no place that contains stories ever allows a full quiet, but softened into the kind of background note you learn to live with. People left small things, an extra bouquet, a ribbon, a coin on a stone. The community, stumbling through its own awkward ritual, tried to help. Babies' shoes were returned to porches. Old lovers walked past and said the names aloud until the sound felt less like an accusation and more like a remedy. Months later, on a clear winter evening, I found the Lewitt plot tidy and the disturbed soil smooth as though an invisible hand had wept the last roughness away. The tin box was kept safe in a small cabinet in my office where I locked it and sometimes opened it like a man checking his pulse. I do not know if that was closure in the absolute sense. I can't claim a miracle. But the scraping never came back in the same way. The voice that had asked for help lost its urgency. It turned, more often than not, into a small whisper of thanks, a quiet I would not have believed if the months had not taught me their lessons. Night work in a cemetery will teach you a lot about how humans hold on. We leave things undone because life is messy, sometimes we leave them because there is simply no time. But some things will not let you go without an audience. Some small griefs need a witness who will sit in the dark and say the right name. I learned to sit with my flashlight across my knees, to press my palm to the cold of a headstone, and to hear the night tell me what it hoped would be finished. If you ever find yourself walking past an old cemetery after the town has slept, listen. Listen for the scrape of metal and the breath between stones. If something asks you in the small, human language of need, you will have to decide whether to step in or step away. Most of us will step away. The brave ones will stay and lend their hands. Either way, the place keeps its record. Stone remembers. Soil holds secrets. People pass on. And sometimes, if you are willing to be present long enough, you might just help a sentence finish that someone forgot how to end. I had been working the cemetery night shift long enough to know which sounds belonged to the living and which belonged to the quiet patience of the dead. The wind had its own accent here, the branches had their rhythm, and even the old iron gates creaked in a way that felt like routine rather than warning. So when something new entered that soundscape, you heard it instantly. Not always clearly, but distinctly. Like a wrong note in a familiar song. That night began ordinarily. My shift started at 10, the sky still carrying the last bruise of dusk. I signed the sheet, picked up the keys, and checked the maintenance log. Nothing unusual. No vandalism reports. No scheduled visitors. The cemetery had felt calmer these weeks, almost restful in a way that made me think the worst of autumn had passed. I grabbed my flashlight and took my usual path along the east walkway, passing the row of old elms that leaned toward each other like tired elders. The gravel shifted under my boots, a comforting sound I knew well. About halfway through the perimeter, I slowed. Something subtle was off. Nothing dramatic. No sudden gust of wind. No obvious movement. Just a sense, like someone was watching me with polite attention. I paused near the older section where the graves carried dates from the early 1900s. The headstones here were tall, thin, meticulously carved. The kind of stonework that made you wonder about the craftsman. As I swept my flashlight across them, something tightened in my stomach. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. As if the cemetery was holding its breath again, waiting for the next scene in a story I hadn't been told yet. Then I heard footsteps. Slow, measured. Crunch of gravel, pause. Crunch, pause. Not hurried, not sneaky, just steady. I clicked off my flashlight automatically, letting my eyes adjust to the moonlit stretch ahead. The footsteps continued, but no silhouette walked the main path. Whoever it was, they were moving between the graves, 2 rows deep, where the lamps didn't reach. I turned the flashlight back on and aimed it toward the sound. The beam skimmed the tops of the headstones and caught on movement, a shape slipping behind a tall marble monument. The figure looked like a woman in a long coat. "Ma'am," I called out, keeping my voice calm. "We're closed after sunset. You can't be here." No answer. Just the faint sound of fabric brushing stone. I stepped between the rows, careful not to tread on anyone's resting place. The grass here was always colder, as though it held the night a little tighter. When I rounded the monument, the woman was gone. A few yards ahead, one of the smaller decorative lanterns flickered out. The flame danced erratically, then settled again. I thought maybe it was the wind, except there was no wind. I swept the area again with my flashlight. "Ma'am, please step out where I can see you. Are you all right?" A soft yes drifted back to me. Not loud, not distressed. Just, close. I took a slow step forward. "Where are you?" No answer. But the footsteps started again, this time circling lightly around me. When I turned, the movement stopped. When I looked forward, it started again, always just outside the circle of my light. It was like she knew exactly how far the beam could reach and stayed just one breath beyond it. I felt heat rise under my jacket. Not from fear, but from the strange sense that this woman didn't want to hide. She wanted to be near me without being seen. "Ma'am," I said again, "if you're lost or hurt, I can walk you to the gate." Silence. Then the faintest whisper. "I'm looking for him." The hair on the back of my neck rose. "Looking for who?" No reply. I moved toward a break in the rows where I could see farther ahead. The grass formed a straight corridor, flanked by two lines of old stones. The moonlight spilled through the opening like a pale ribbon. And then, halfway down the aisle, I saw her. A woman standing perfectly still. Back straight, hands at her sides. Coat long enough that it brushed the tops of her shoes. She wasn't facing me. She wasn't facing any grave. She stood turned slightly toward the shadows, head tilted up as if listening to someone I couldn't see. I approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Evening, ma'am. Are you lost?" She tilted her head a little more. "I'm waiting." "For who?" I asked. She raised her arm and pointed at a nearby headstone. I followed her gesture. The name on the stone was James Hartwell. Died 1978. Beloved husband and father. Nothing unusual. A standard inscription worn by years. I looked back toward the woman. But she wasn't there. Not an inch of movement, not a drifting shadow, just gone. I swept the flashlight rapidly, scanning between the graves. My breath grew short. The grass, soft and heavy with dew, carried no footprints except my own. I called out again, louder. "Ma'am. Please respond." The cemetery answered with a long silence. I circled the Hartwell grave and checked behind the stone. Nothing. I checked the next row. Still nothing. I was about to assume she'd run off through the back fence when I noticed something at the base of the Hartwell headstone. A single wilted flower. Not just old, recently placed. It still had moisture on the stem. And right beside it, in the damp grass, was a woman's shoe print. Small. Clean, sharp edges. No matching second footprint. That was impossible. Even if she'd been standing still, she should have left two prints. I crouched down, running a finger along the impression. The earth wasn't sunken from weight. The print was pressed into the ground. Neat. Intentional. Like someone had held a shoe and pushed it firmly into soft soil. And next to the print, barely visible in the beam, was a small folded paper. When I picked it up, I saw two handwritten words inside. He promised. My throat tightened. The air grew colder, not breeze cold, presence cold. Then, from behind me, her voice again, closer than before. He said he'd walk home with me. I spun fast, flashlight whipping across the graves. She stood 6 feet away, staring at the ground between us. I didn't hear her approach. Not even a hint of footsteps. I didn't mean to frighten you, I said carefully, though my pulse disagreed with the sentiment. Who made that promise? She lifted her face toward mine, but the shadows hid her expression. James. James Hartwell? I asked, motioning toward the grave. She nodded once, slowly. I swallowed. Ma'am. James passed away in 1978. I know, she whispered. The answer came so simply that, for a second, it felt like an ordinary conversation. Just two people acknowledging a sad truth. But then she stepped forward, and her foot made no sound in the grass. I backed up gently. Ma'am, are you, all right? Do you need help? I'm waiting, she said again, voice thicker now. He said he would meet me here. I've been waiting such a long time. I'm tired. I took a breath. What's your name? She tilted her head in that same quiet, listening way. He knows. Ma'am, please, let me help you. But she stepped backward instead. One slow step, then another. And without turning, without so much as shifting her shoulders, she began moving between the stones. Not walking, not sliding. Just moving, as if the darkness absorbed her and carried her forward. Wait. I called. But she continued until the moonlight kissed the hem of her coat. She stopped for one heartbeat, long enough for me to think she might turn. Instead, she whispered. Tell him I kept my promise. Then she faded into the dim rose behind her. Not vanished in a burst. Not blinked out like a trick of the light. She simply walked deeper into the cemetery until the night swallowed her. I searched for her for nearly an hour. Covered every row. Checked every side path. Scanned the fences. Nothing. No footprints. No sound. No movement. But when I returned to the Hartwell grave, the wilted flower was gone. And next to the stone, where that shoe print had been, the ground now held two perfect impressions. Side by side, a matching pair. That was the moment I stopped calling her, the woman. And started calling her what she was. A promise keeping itself alive long after both people had gone. Sometimes the dead don't haunt the living. They haunt the promises that were never kept. And sometimes, they keep them anyway. I had learned the cemetery in a way most people never do. Walking those paths night after night makes the place less like a location and more like a companion you visit, nod to, and sometimes argue with in your head. Names become familiar the way grocery items do. You notice when a familiar label is missing, and you notice faster when something is wrong. So when I first saw that headstone and felt the odd, immediate recognition that it was wrong, the alarm inside me behaved like a tool I had used often enough to trust. It was cold the night it happened, the kind of November cold that bites at the ears, but the lamps held steady and the frost on the grass glittered under the beam of my flashlight, making every small thing easier to see and harder to explain. I was on my late shift, the one that starts after most people have forgotten the day exists, and I was doing the rounds the way I always do, with a radio clipped to my belt and the maintenance log tucked in the pocket of my jacket. The gate had clicked shut behind me and the gravel had that familiar soft hush underfoot. The older north row is where the stones sit closer together, where the dates get older and the carvings grow fainter, and I passed through there on habit because you learn to give respect to the old names first. I had a routine for checking the headstones, glance, note, step on if you must, record anything that looked damaged. That night, my light hit a stone that didn't sit right with me, and that wrongness moved past ordinary concern into an odd ache in my chest. The stone read like a worn page you hadn't expected to find. It said Eliza Barrow, 1909 to 1942, beloved daughter, a neat serif engraving softened at the edges by years of weather. But I knew that stone, I had walked past it hundreds of times and in my head it had always belonged to a different name, one I could say without thinking. I crouched down and set my palm against the cold marble, trying to steady the small absurd certainty that memory can suddenly become the only proof you trust. The carving had age, moss in its pips, the same where the other stones showed, nothing new to the eye, and yet the letters spelled something my mind swore had been changed. I radioed the office with a voice that kept its professional edge, told them to note the location and said I'd double-check with the crew in the morning, but the radio static and the dispatcher's light replies couldn't settle the tightness spreading through me. A sound broke the hush behind me, slow and careful footfalls that moved between the stones without meeting the main gravel path, and instantly I felt watched in the way people do who think they are alone and then aren't. I turned the beam and moved toward the sound, keeping the light low because high light sometimes startles the old edgings of a place like this, and the dead can be especially sensitive to blinding things. Whoever was there kept to the shadows, always a step away from the circle of my flashlight, and their movement was steady and deliberate, not the chaotic scuttle of an animal or the clumsy stride of someone drunk. When I called out, the voice that answered was quiet and had a tone like it had been waiting a long time to be heard. It said simply, he wasn't supposed to take her name, and the words felt like a small complaint carried on a wind everyone else ignored. I stepped closer to the stone and watched the letters under my beam, certain now that I had not imagined them. They shifted, subtly but undeniably, like a sentence being edited where you could see the eraser move across the paper. The name settled into Thomas Barrow, 1910 to 1961, beloved husband, and for a moment my brain protested in the old language of the job, records, maps, the crew's notes. Nothing matched the movement my eyes had just witnessed. I pressed my fingertips again to the face of the stone, feeling the roughness that 100 nights had made a familiar texture, and I could not reconcile the history I thought I knew with the text that now lay before me. The cold settled in my ribs deeper, not exactly fear but a careful tension, the kind you feel when a neighbor's dog smells different and you realize it's not theirs anymore. I told myself aloud I would keep watch until dawn if I had to, that I would not let this be the sort of nightly story you swallow without proof. The voice came closer then, not in sound but in presence, an impression of someone who had edged near enough for me to feel their breath in the air to the left of my neck, and their next words were small and exact. He buried her as someone else, it said, and the sentence held the weight of a ledger entry that had been skipped. When I turned my flashlight more fully toward the figure stepping into the slice of moonlight, I saw a woman whose clothes did not belong to this current year, a coat and dress softened by the dim so it looked like another era had slipped into our night. Her face was not gaunt nor grotesque, it held a worn dignity and something like patient anger. She did not shout or plead, she spoke the way a person offers a fact that another should simply amend, as if the adjustment were minor and evidently overdue. She said her name as if she expected it to be recognized, though recognition in this place is never simple. "Mara," she said. The word fell into the cold and seemed to hang there, waiting for an answer I did not have. I asked if she needed help, if she was lost, if she had family nearby, because those are the practical questions that sometimes bring an ordinary problem into the light. She looked at me with eyes that had seen a long number of seasons and replied, "He took me for his sister." The sentence might have been nonsense if not for the lack of drama in her tone, it landed like a small correction on a ledger. The implication was crooked and human, someone who loved had buried a woman under another name, and that act had left an unfinished thing that would not let itself be forgotten. I listened and learned the shape of the grief she held. She told me that Thomas had been a complicated man in life, fond of drinking and of promises he never kept, and when a fire or an accident or a wandering boat took someone important to him, he had not wanted the town to know who had gone. He had, in a panic or in a shameful kindness, claimed the missing woman as a sister to hide whatever truth would have branded him. The small civic lie, the sort that seems to protect someone for a moment, had planted a seed in the soil that the grave could not hold. Names are the spine of memory, she explained, and when a spine is altered the body argues. She had been forgotten in the record and misfiled in the stone, but memory resists tidy clerks, memory pushes at the edges until it gets what it needs. When she eased close to the stone, the marble changed again, gently at first and then with a soft certainty, and the letters rearranged before me until the stone read Mara Barrow, 1912 to 1942, beloved wife, as if the world had, finally, allowed the truth to replace the lie. I felt the lightness of a room sighing when someone opens a window, a small mercy in the air. Her lips moved with quiet gratitude, and the sound of her thanks was almost too small to be heard outside my chest. For a breath I thought it might be over, that the small correction would settle and the town's ledger would not notice the difference. But the cemetery is a slow bureaucracy and sometimes proofs are slow to be accepted. I asked her how she had been waiting so long, what had tethered her to that place, and she told me a memory that fit inside the kind of simple devotion people rarely speak of aloud. She remembered a promise to wait until he came back and march home together, a small domestic hope in the way people make futures in the hush of ordinary days. She remembered a river crossing, a late-night argument that ended in a decision to walk while the dawn was still dark, and then nothing. The town told one story, the family told another, and in the middle, her name had been smudged by time into a shape that would not stick. She had come back in the slow hours, the night when the cemetery breathed softer, and had refused to let the record rest as a lie. She told me that sometimes the dead take a long route to correct the world, and that she had patience. As I listened to her I felt the heavy logic of my job begin to flex into an odd compassion I had not expected. There are protocols in this line of work, logs, calls, maintenance reports that sound like bureaucratic hymns, but what do you do when a life needs an amendment the law cannot understand? I fetched a thin pair of gloves from the shed, not because the cold required them but because making a small human gesture felt like an act of courtesy in a place where etiquette was often overlooked. She asked me not for money or testimony, but to be witness, and witness is a small but fierce thing, it keeps truth from dissolving. I stood there with the gloved hands in the dark while she touched the stone and watched the name remain as she needed it to be. In the morning the grounds crew turned up with coffee and the clockwork humor of people who find meaning in small rituals. They found the stone with Mara's name carved deep in the century-etched marble and shook their heads at the oddness without being unkind. When you live long enough in a small town, oddities become part of the daily wallpaper. I showed them the locket I had found tucked in the grass near the base of the headstone, a rusted oval with two tiny photographs inside, one labeled Thomas, the other unmarked, but the face matched the woman I had seen. They took it and filed it in the office where small curious things are kept in labeled drawers. We wrote an incident report with neutral tone and precise phrases, and the municipal clerk suggested we leave the record as is until families brought forward any claim. There was the practical sentence of the bureaucracy, and we allowed it to exist beside the less tidy reality we had witnessed at night. Weeks passed and the scraping of unresolved grief in that corner of the cemetery quieted into a softer pattern. Other small gestures began to appear at Mara's stone, a pressed flower here, a note there, a newly polished corner. People who had never told each other about the oddities began to say quietly at the hardware store that the dead sometimes ask for their names back. It's a kind of superstition and a kind of municipal care, we offer small repairs and the town supplies small absolutions. Once, a woman who remembered being a child in the neighborhood left a ribbon because she recalled an old story her grandmother used to tell, and when she did, she said aloud that sometimes what gets lost returns because someone remembered to look. Months turned into seasons and the winter dirt softened to thaw and then to rain, and for me the locket stayed in the office drawer like a talisman I didn't know how to explain. I would take it out now and then, opening the tiny rusted hinge until it made that soft tired sound, looking at the two little faces that seemed to smile at me from within. Each time I did, I thought of promise and error and the way human choices make monuments brittle and then, sometimes, mendable. The woman who had been Mara did not come to me again in the same way. When I walked the rows on late nights afterward there were fewer corrections to make and an ease I could not have measured before. She had not been violent, she had not demanded, she had only wanted a name to match a life, and that small wish had been enough to demand the world's attention. If there is a lesson here it is a small practical one, names matter, and in places that keep memory they matter more than most of us understand. A name carved in stone is not just a record, it is a conversation between the dead and the living, and sometimes that conversation needs human witnesses to be heard properly. I still walk that row some nights, and occasionally the lamp seems to glow a little kinder over Mara's stone, as if the world had agreed to a correction and could now rest slightly straighter in its bed. People ask me why I stay at a job like that, why I choose to be the one who sees the small, quiet things other people do not want to think about. My answer is always the same: somebody has to listen when a promise is broken, somebody has to stand still and let memory fix its course. The stones will outlast us, but it is our job to make sure they say what needs to be said. If you ever walk past a cemetery late at night and your steps slow, or your breath catches, or you feel the odd sensation of being politely corrected by the world, be kind in the dark. There are names that ask the living to remember properly, and if you can spare the attention, you might just find a small truth put back into its place. I have a map of the cemetery in my head that no one else can read the same way. After years of night shifts you memorize not just where things are, but how they sound and how they feel. A leaning stone reads like a sentence, a cracked angel reads like punctuation, and a lamppost reads like a breath. The night I first saw the lantern walking on its own began like any other shift. I flipped the gate lock, the gravel gave its soft complaint under my boots, and the lamps blinked into dull life along the paths. There was a cold that cut straight through my jacket that night, the kind that makes your fingers less coordinated and your breath look like smoke, but the lamps held steady and the place seemed honest enough. I expected the familiar boredom of routine patrols, the small noises of the living slipping past the dead, and nothing more. I was halfway through the older northern rows, the part where the stones sit crowded and the dates have a soft grain to them, when a warm glow threaded through the graves ahead of me. It was amber, not white, and it moved like a thought rather than a person. It slid between the headstones with no bounce, no rhythm of a walker, and the way it skimmed the ground made my chest go tight. At first I assumed someone had brought a lantern and hidden from me as a prank. Kids and drunks sometimes trespass just to test their luck. But as the glow kept drifting it didn't flicker from hand movement and it didn't cast a silhouette. It was a lantern carried by absence, a small flame in glass moving through space that should have been empty. I called out the polite thing because habit outruns fear. "Hello, grounds are closed," I said, and the light didn't change its course. My word sounded small in that hollow place, and the beam of my flashlight made a thin, arrogant slice across the marble faces as if daring the dark to answer. The lantern threaded ahead of me and I noticed then that it hovered nearly shoulder-high, gliding without weight. It had the design of metal ribs around glass, an old-fashioned shape you might see in an antique shop, and inside there was a wick that breathed and burned slow. When I moved closer the glow tilted as if acknowledging me, and rather than feeling defiant or dangerous, it gave me an impression of purpose, the kind that asks more politely than it commands. I followed because curiosity is a stronger habit than caution. When you work nights long enough, you begin to collect stories like others collect stamps, and you cannot resist a riddle set to move. The lantern drifted between rows I knew by heart and it guided me to a corner I visited less often, a place where the headstones slumped and grass tangled as if trying to hide something. It paused beneath the remains of a stone angel whose right arm had been broken off some time long ago, the marble darkened by weather and shaded like an unfinished gesture. The light hovered near the angel's base then dipped toward the ground as if pointing me to a small plain stone at her feet. When I brushed frost away from the face I read the letters, and the name did a small, unfamiliar thing inside my memory. Martha Wills, 1859 to 1881, gone before her time. The name did not ring with any gossip in town or any of our maintenance notes. No one had reported recent visits or anything odd there. Yet the lantern remained poised above that particular grave as though it had been waiting for me precisely there. The soil around the headstone looked as undisturbed as morning fog and the engraving had that worn soft depth of age, nothing to suggest a new drama or fresh hands. Still, the lantern pulsed, an insistence without sound, and the ground near the stone gave a gentle, almost shy little settling as if something below had shifted in response to the light. It was the kind of small thing that a man who has watched too many odd nights feels inside his ribs before his head can make sense of it. I crouched and set my glove to the soil, the chill passing through leather to skin, and the dirt felt ordinary under my fingers, old, compact, patient. I asked aloud because speaking makes events shareable and therefore less frightening, "Martha, what do you want?" There was no voice, but the lantern rose and drifted a few feet away, then turned and moved with a deliberate grace toward the east side of the cemetery where older family plots sat beneath heavy elms. It was as if someone had lit the lantern to guide me on a path I had not been invited to before. I rose and followed, wondering at every step whether I was part of some morning ritual I had been left out of, or whether I had wandered into a place that time and town had forgotten. As the lantern led me I realized it kept a careful distance from the stones. It never struck a headstone with a glare, instead it washed them softly, painting their names in amber that made the letters look like embers. It avoided the graves of infants and instead brushed the larger stones the way a respectful hand might clear dust from a book. There is a human etiquette in even the weirdest things in a place like this, and the lantern seemed to honor it. After a while the light slipped between two tightly set monuments and slowed. I could hear the faint scrape of metal under my boots and the distant hum of a road that cut beyond the far trees. The lantern stopped at a small, half-sunken crypt I had walked past many times and paid no real mind to because it was sealed and sleepy and inconveniently off the map. The crypt was older than most structures here, built of stone that took the rain as a slow insult, with ivy braided over its doorway like a sleeping beard. The metal door was cracked open just a fraction, a shadowed seam that suggested someone had touched it recently or that the building itself exhaled now and then. The lantern slowed and glided to the threshold, then stopped as if waiting to be let through. When I pushed the heavy door, the smell that met me was old stone and colder earth and the kind of dust that remembers footsteps, and the lantern moved deeper inside with the single intimacy of guiding a hand through a small dark room. Inside the chamber the air felt like a held breath. My flashlight revealed alcoves and shelves, niches worn smooth where mourners had once rested, urns or left tokens that survived better than memory. The lantern floated to the far wall and there, behind a gutter of moss, was a small plaque set into the stone. When I reached the plaque and wiped at it with the back of my glove, the letters shone faintly under the amber glow. Here lie Thomas and Martha Wills, joined in death as life divided them. The sentence read like an explanation written for anyone who would bother to open the door, and the punctuation on the stone felt like a gentle finality someone had carved with a hand that wanted to be understood. I stood with the plaque in my sights and felt something in the room shift from expectant to satisfied. The lantern hovered at the center of the chamber and brightened, not like a signal but like applause paid soft. Then from the doorway of the crypt there was the faintest movement, as if two people had crossed the threshold of years into the present with the small dignity of those who take their time coming home. They were not visible clearly to the eye in the way the living are, but their outlines resolved into a man and a woman standing side by side beneath the arch. They did not step toward me in menace. They held themselves as though they had finally completed a long walk. I felt something close to relief wash through the place, like a hand smoothing a rumpled sheet. My voice was a small thing in the high stone ceiling when I said, "You wanted to be together." I had not meant it as a question, but the sense of confirmation settled into the room without words. The woman's figure tilted her head as if to regard me personally, and I noticed her profile in the amber light, young and worn in a way that makes grief look patient. The man beside her looked older in the way men do when they carry regret, and though their outlines remained soft, the room held them like a frame holds a picture. The lantern pulsed once and lowered until it rested on the floor between the two graves, its flame steady and whole as if the two silhouettes had come to claim a small, human comfort. I had the odd impulse to kneel, because some gestures are simpler than explanations, and because everything about that room said that words were too clumsy. Instead I reached and touched the lantern. It was colder than its light implied, metal dulled by time and handled by hands that had lived long enough to know small mercies. My fingers felt a tremor run along its rim, like the echo of someone else's touch. I carried it outside into the night, and as I stepped back across the threshold the two shapes receded like breath, not vanished but folding into the stone as if there had been a conversation with the earth itself that needed no further language. Outside, the cemetery air felt different, softened in a way that made the lampposts look less harsh, and when I walked past Thomas's and Martha's stones later that night I found the soil hair smooth and even as if a gardener had spent an exacting hour there. The angel's broken arm caught the moonlight and her remaining hand seemed less like a question and more like an indication, as if she had pointed out the lantern so the world could understand why things had been disturbed. I set the lantern carefully between the two stones on an unremarkable patch of turf and it burned without flicker, a small steady globe of light that did not demand ceremony but gave it anyway. Word moved through the town in slow breaths, people talked because that is how the living try to render the odd into rules. The maintenance crew came by the next morning with coffee and quiet faces, and we checked records and maps and found the crypt listed but hardly noted. The dates matched a story of separate burials stitched together by time and circumstance. There was no headline, no mayoral proclamation, and yet small acts followed, a ribbon left at the angel's base, a washed marble placed beside a stone, housewives carrying the memory of the lantern under their tongues as they exchanged stories at the market. The cemetery felt lighter in a way you could feel if you walked its lanes at dawn. A place that had been tense now had the slackening of a muscle that does not need to hold so tightly any longer. I kept the lantern for a week, not because it was mine to keep, but because certain objects are like witness statements and they demand a soul to keep them safe until the right moment. Each night I would light it and walk slowly through the rows, watching how it listened to the stones, how it respected the names. People who came later said they saw the light moving between the graves in that steady way and assumed the caretaker had placed it or some ritual happened in secret. When I finally returned it to the pair's graves, the ground accepted it as if it had been waiting, and when the flame took again between them I felt the finality of a sentence closed properly. There are nights that still make you watch the shadows twice, and there are little gestures, the odd bouquet, the stone polished where no one would usually polish, that make you think the dead have company. The lantern never walked again in the way I had first seen it. Sometimes things need their single, delicate correction and then they sleep. The crypt door remained slightly ajar for a few weeks and then adjusted back to its place, and the ivy grew as ivy does, patient and slow. I returned to my rounds with a new map in my head, one that contained not only places but stories settled into their proper names and pairings. It is a tidy thing to say, but the cemetery taught me that attention matters, that somebody being seen is often the thing that lets a story finish. If you ever find yourself walking past a quiet plot and you see a small warm glow thread between the stones, don't assume spectacle or hoax right away. Sometimes it is a lantern asking that two names be placed beside one another properly, sometimes it is a comfort passed between hands that no longer belong to the living. Offer your witness if you can. Stand there a while. Listen. In my work I have learned that some remedies are very small, an hour of patient company, a candle set between stones, a hand placed on cool marble, and that is enough to make, for a time, the world settle straight. I had always believed I understood what silence meant, especially the kind of silence that settles after midnight in a cemetery as old as Marrow Field. For years I'd walked the grounds with my lantern and keys, following the same gravel paths, checking the same rows of stones, and listening for anything that didn't belong. It was a quiet world, predictable in its own way, and after enough nights the hush of the cemetery became something I could read like weather. A shift in the wind meant a storm coming. The soft sway of dry leaves meant deer were moving through. Even the distant echo of a gate creaking could tell me if someone had entered after hours. But that autumn, as the cold crept in and the nights grew longer, the silence changed. It wasn't emptier, just fuller in a way I couldn't explain, as if someone invisible had joined my rounds and kept pace a few steps behind. The first time I noticed it was on a Tuesday, a night I remember because the fog hung low enough to blur everything past 10 feet. My lantern lit only a small circle around me, and beyond that the world was soft, gray, and waiting. I had almost finished my rounds when I passed by the old caretaker's cabin, the one abandoned decades ago and left to lean slightly toward the north fence. The door was always shut, pulled tight by age and weather, and the windows were clouded with dust. But that night, as I approached, the air seemed different. I sensed warmth radiating from a building that had no electricity and no fireplace. When I stepped closer, I saw it, a faint sliver of light under the door, not strong enough to illuminate the step, but clear enough to make me stop. I should have gone back for help or at least radioed someone, but curiosity and duty often pull in the same direction in this job. I lifted my lantern, letting the glow settle on the wood grain of the door. It looked the same as always, old, warped, nailed shut from the inside years before I first started working there. I leaned in, listening. Usually, the cabin was silent, its insides full of dust and rusted tools. But tonight I heard something soft and repetitive, like a steady brushing sound, almost like someone sweeping the floor in slow, thoughtful strokes. It wasn't hurried, nor was it rhythmic enough to be mechanical. It sounded like someone working. I stepped back, unsure whether to knock or simply walk away. But the brushing sound paused, as if whoever, or whatever, was inside had sensed me. Then a faint gust of warm air drifted through the slight gap beneath the door, carrying with it a smell that settled deep in my memory, the scent of pine cleaner and fresh earth, the exact combination I used every evening to wipe down the chapel pews before locking up. That mixture didn't exist naturally in the cabin. Someone, or something, was trying to speak in a language I recognized. I stayed there for a long moment, lantern raised, waiting for the sound to return. It didn't. The light beneath the door faded slowly, like an ember dying from lack of breath. I touched the doorknob, half expecting it to be warm, but it was cold, colder than the surrounding air. When I turned it, it barely moved. The door was still locked from the inside. Whatever had been there hadn't left through the door. The next morning I asked the grounds manager about the cabin. He told me the last caretaker who lived there died nearly 50 years ago. A quiet man named Haver. Liked to work alone. Often stayed past his shift, walking the grounds with an old brass lantern that everyone knew by its strange, warm glow. When he died, that lantern was buried with him, his only request. Hearing this didn't help the unease settling in my chest. If anything, it made it worse. The night before, the faint glow under the cabin door had looked exactly like the warm light of an old brass lantern. And that brushing sound, sweeping, that had been one of Haver's routines. Every caretaker has habits, and some, it seems, cling even after the caretaker is gone. I returned to work that night with a strange mix of dread and expectation. I walked my usual rounds, but my eyes kept drifting toward the cabin. The fog wasn't as thick as the night before, yet the cabin seemed to stand slightly apart from the rest of the grounds, as though the earth was giving it space. When I finally approached it, I felt the smallest vibration in the air, like someone had just spoken a word too soft to hear. The cabin's door remained shut, the sliver of light gone. But I noticed something new, a faint trail in the dirt, starting from the step and continuing toward the headstones. It wasn't a boot print. It wasn't animal. It was a soft, smooth line, like something heavy had been carried, a lantern perhaps, dragging ever so lightly as it moved. I followed the trail, my lantern held low to catch the shallow impressions in the soil. They led across the grounds, past the newer graves and toward the older section where the headstones leaned at tired angles. The trail ended at a grave I had passed 100 times but never examined closely. The stone was simple, worn by decades of weather. And on its surface, in the faint orange cast of my lantern, I saw the name, Harold Haver, keeper of these grounds. Someone had cleared the grass around his grave recently. The dirt was brushed smooth, too clean to be untouched. A small, polished stone rested on the headstone, a gesture the living rarely gave to Haver anymore because the living barely remembered him. But the dead, I suppose, do not forget their own. I stood there longer than I needed to, lantern held against the night, listening to the quiet hum of the cemetery as it breathed around me. I didn't see anything move. I didn't hear anything speak. But I felt something, an acknowledgement, a presence settling back into place now that it had shown me what it needed to. That night when I passed the cabin again, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. Not open enough to see inside, but no longer sealed by years of stillness. I didn't touch it. I didn't close it. Some spaces in this work are not for the living to rearrange. By the end of the week, small changes appeared across the cemetery. Wilted bouquets had been replaced with fresh wildflowers in places only a longtime caretaker would know were important. Tools left in the shed were arranged more neatly than I kept them. The chapel's floor, which I usually swept at the start of my shift, was already spotless when I arrived. I sensed the rhythm of the ground shifting, not in a threatening way, but in the way a place adjusts when someone returns home and resumes their old responsibilities quietly. Every evening I felt a second presence walking with me, never close, never intrusive, but steady. When I checked the graves, I'd sometimes catch the faintest scent of pine cleaner, lingering where no living hand had worked. When I paused at the gate, I'd feel the slightest warmth behind me, as though someone stood just far enough away to avoid startling me. One night as I prepared to lock the chapel, I looked across the cemetery and saw a soft, warm glow drifting slowly between the stones. It moved with the same gentle sway I'd seen in lanterns carried by old caretakers who loved their work enough to treat the cemetery like a living companion. I should have been afraid, I know that. But fear is often nothing more than misunderstanding, and I understood this. I didn't walk toward the glow. I didn't interrupt. I let the grounds be tended by hands that remembered the work far better than mine. The light drifted for several minutes, pausing by certain stones as though checking on them, then finally settled near the old oak before fading like a breath into the cool night air. In the days that followed, I never saw the glow again. I never heard sweeping from the cabin or felt the warmth of a presence walking behind me. Everything returned to its usual silence. But the cemetery felt different, as though something had been put back in its proper place and no longer needed to call attention to itself. I kept thinking about that faint line in the dirt, the trail of a lantern carried by someone who had been gone for decades. The way it led me to Haver's grave. The way the cabin door shifted from sealed to slightly open. Some stories don't announce themselves loudly. Some simply ask to be witnessed so they can settle again. Now, during my rounds, I always pause by Haver's grave. I fix the flowers when they wilt and brush away the leaves when they gather. Not because of fear, but because someone once showed me that caretaking doesn't stop when breath does. It continues in the small rituals, in the quiet attention, in the acknowledgement that even the forgotten deserve to be remembered. And sometimes, when the fog is low and the wind is still, I feel a soft warmth at my shoulder. A quiet thank you. A passing acknowledgement from the one who walked the grounds long before me. I don't turn to look. Some presences are best respected by letting them continue their rounds. I had walked the west fence of Marrowfield Cemetery so many times that I could trace the path even with my eyes closed. The old cedar trees along that edge rustled differently from the rest of the grounds, their branches hanging low like they were listening for something buried beneath them. For years, I thought the west side was simply quieter, more withdrawn, a place the wind passed gently out of respect. But everything changed the night I noticed the grave beneath the largest cedar, one that never seemed to gather even a single fallen leaf no matter how wildly the branches shook above it. I had assumed it was coincidence at first. Cemeteries love coincidence the way old houses love creaking floors. But after a while, you start recognizing what belongs and what doesn't, what feels like a pattern and what feels like attention. The grave wasn't special at first glance. A simple rounded marker, a little cracked toward the base, the name almost worn off. Families didn't visit it anymore. The register said the last visitor signed in over 23 years ago. The woman buried there, Margaret Thorne, had lived a quiet life and died quietly too, if the records were to be believed. A schoolteacher. No spouse. No children. Just a few photographs in a small box stored in the archive, pieces of a life that didn't leave much noise behind. Yet someone, or something, kept her grave spotless, even when the rest of the grounds drowned in cedar leaves. I noticed it first on a wind-heavy night near the end of October. Leaves were tumbling across the paths in thick waves, piling against stones and drifting into open patches of grass like small, rust-colored dunes. I had spent almost an hour brushing them away from the newer graves where families still visited, but when I approached Margaret's stone, I froze. The grass around it lay perfectly clean, not a single leaf touching the soil. The cedar above her swayed in deep, sweeping motions, shedding clusters of leaves onto every grave nearby, yet somehow refusing to drop anything on hers. It wasn't logical. The wind doesn't choose favorites. But something had. I knelt beside the stone, brushing my fingers across the earth. The soil wasn't disturbed. No footprints. No signs of tools. No brush marks. Just an untouched circle of ground as though the air itself had bent around it to keep it clean. I brushed one leaf toward the grave intentionally, just to test. The moment it touched the boundary of that invisible circle, the wind shifted and pushed it away with a sudden, deliberate sweep. The air moved with intention. It wasn't random. The next night, I returned early. The evening light was fading into a muted blue, the kind that makes the oldest stones glow faintly with cold. I checked other graves first, each one covered with the usual mess of cedar and oak leaves, and then made my way toward Margaret's. Still spotless. Still protected. Still quietly tended by something I couldn't yet name. As I stood there, lantern in hand, I felt a subtle warmth around the grave, not enough to break the autumn chill but enough to soften it. It felt like someone had been standing there moments before I arrived, someone whose presence lingered for just a breath after their absence. I sat on the bench near the cedar, the bark rough beneath my palm, and watched the grave as the last of the daylight drained from the sky. The cemetery shifted into its nighttime voice, a quiet hum that sounded like the earth settling deeper into itself. I listened. Not for footsteps or voices or any ghostly theatrics, but for the small things caretakers learn to hear, the way grass bends when someone invisible walks through it, or how air changes temperature when a memory grows close. After 20 minutes or so, a faint rustle drifted through the branches, followed by the soft slide of a leaf falling directly above the grave. I watched it descend in a slow spiral, certain it would land on the stone. Instead, just inches before touching the ground, it shifted direction as though guided by a gentle hand and drifted harmlessly aside. Someone was tending Margaret's grave. Someone who wasn't alive. I leaned forward slightly, my breath held, not out of fear but respect. Cemeteries teach you early that not every presence wants attention. Some simply want to continue doing what they did in life. And in that quiet moment, I realized this wasn't a haunting. It was devotion. The next night I brought a small notebook and sat by the cedar again. The air was cold enough that my breath fogged in front of me, but the area around the grave felt different, just a touch warmer, the way air gets after sunlight lingers too long on stone. I watched as leaves fell around it. The ones beyond the invisible boundary piled into mounds, but the ones falling too close drifted away as though nudged by something careful, something practiced. After nearly an hour of quiet observation, I spoke softly into the night. "I see what you're doing," I whispered. "And I'll help if you want." The wind settled. The air warmed slightly. And though no voice answered, something shifted around me. A presence leaning in, acknowledging, appreciating. The following afternoon, I dug through the cemetery archives hoping to find something about Margaret. Old journals, caretaker notes, visitor logs, most of it faded and brittle. But in a folder from 1964, I found a sentence scribbled in the margin by a caretaker long before my time. "Margaret Thorne tends the graves even now." No explanation, no story. Just that single sentence written in hurried script. I returned to the grave that night with a small broom and began gently sweeping the surrounding area, careful not to disturb the pattern the invisible caretaker had already set. I didn't want to intrude, I wanted to assist. The broom bristles moved softly across the soil, quiet enough to blend with the night air. After a moment, I felt the warmth return, settling behind my shoulder like someone standing close enough to watch but far enough to let me work. As I swept, I found small smooth stones arranged subtly around the marker, stones I hadn't noticed before. They formed a loose arc at the front of the grave, almost like a gesture of protection. I touched one and felt it was warmer than the ground around it. Not hot, not supernatural, just warm. Familiar, even. Like it had been held in a hand moments ago. "Thank you," I murmured without thinking. The cedar branches rustled gently though the wind was still. Over the next week, every time I passed Margaret's grave, it greeted me the same way, clean, tended, peaceful. Sometimes I felt that faint warmth drift past me, settling by the headstone as though someone invisible knelt there. Sometimes leaves would slide softly away without touching the stone. And once, when I approached too quickly, the air around the grave shifted sharply, as though startled, before settling again when I realized my mistake and slowed my steps. One night, right after a heavy rainfall, I walked toward the grave expecting the soil to be messy and lumped with wet leaves. But when I arrived, the area was completely clear. The rainwater had formed a perfect smooth ring around the grave, outlining the space the unseen caretaker had kept clean. Everything beyond the circle was drenched and muddy, but the grave itself was untouched, as though protected by a barrier that let nothing intrude. I knelt there, brushing my fingertips along the wet earth at the boundary line. There was no ridge, no physical marker, no difference in texture. But there was a presence, a steady weight of attention. "Margaret?" I whispered into the damp silence. "If you're here, you can rest. You've done enough." A soft exhale of warm air brushed past my cheek. I didn't move, I didn't speak again. I simply stayed until the warmth faded and the night returned to stillness. For weeks afterward, the grave remained clear each night. I began placing small white flowers there, simple ones that didn't draw much attention but looked peaceful in the lantern light. Every morning, the flowers were still there, but always arranged slightly differently, as though someone had adjusted them with gentle, practiced hands. And one night, when the wind was calm and the stars looked like scattered candle flames pinned to the dark, I saw it. A faint shimmer above the grave, not bright enough to be a light, not solid enough to be a figure, just a soft glow, like someone breathing warmth into the cold air. It hovered for only a moment before settling down across the surface of the stone, making the engraving shine faintly before disappearing into the soil. Some caretakers never stop tending. Some devotions don't end with the heartbeat. Some presences stay because love is a habit they never learn to break. If you ever walk by a grave that seems cleaner than the rest, a grave untouched by wind or season, pause a moment. Someone may still be tending it. Quietly, patiently, lovingly. Waiting for you to notice. I had worked at the cemetery long enough to know which parts of the grounds carried stories and which parts simply carried silence. Some places feel like stone and soil, plain and heavy, without memory. And then there are corners that hold a weight you can sense from 20 steps away, where the wind moves differently, and the air seems to wait for you. This story began in one of those corners. It started on a cold morning when the sun was still deciding whether it wanted to rise. Mist clung low to the grass, and the world felt padded, muffled, as if wrapped in cotton. I was doing my usual walk from the gate to the East Row routine, counting off the headstones the way other people count steps. The eastern side is older. The stones there lean slightly, like people huddling together for warmth. And on that morning, something caught my eye before I even reached the corner plot. A movement. A shift. Something that nudged my attention the way a whisper nudges your ear. There was a grave there, a singular stone, not remarkable in shape or color. But it was the way the soil moved that pulled me forward. Soil doesn't move. Not on its own. But this did. It rose and fell in a slow rhythm, like something beneath it was breathing. I stopped 5 feet away. Not closer. Not yet. I watched the ground rise gently. Then fall. Then rise again. A steady pulse, a calm inhale, a quiet exhale. Not frantic, not forced, just breathing. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, looked again. The ground still lifted. Slowly. Softly. Like it had lungs. I thought the mist was playing tricks, the way light bends through cold air. But then a leaf resting on the soil lifted an inch with the swell, then settled as the earth sank. Leaves don't do that on their own. I crouched slightly, not enough to get closer, but enough to steady my view. And that's when I noticed something else. No other grave in that row had disturbed soil. All were still, the frost caught on the edges of the grass, crisp and unmoving. Only this one had warmth. A faint warmth that softened the frost. I could see where the ice had melted near the top of the mound. A patch of dark, moist soil surrounded the stone like a halo of breath. "The hell," I murmured under my breath, but even my whisper felt too loud. Part of me wanted to walk away, pretend I hadn't seen anything. But the job doesn't let you walk away from things that don't make sense. You're supposed to look closer. Notice details. Keep records. So I stepped forward and brushed the nameplate clean with my glove. Marion Hartley. 1937 to 2009. Loved beyond words. Nothing unusual in the inscription. Nothing to explain why the earth above Marion Hartley's grave rose and fell like a sleeping chest. I stood there for a full minute. 60 long breaths. 50 rises. 50 falls. Each one steady. Each one measured. Each one completely wrong. Eventually the soil stilled. Flattened. like someone exhaled their last breath and then lay perfectly still. I stepped back instinctively, heart hammering in my ribs, because something stopping is always worse than something moving. For a moment the grave was quiet, too quiet. And then, softly, just once, the ground pulled inward. As if something beneath the surface had inhaled sharply. A single, deep, deliberate breath. I felt the air around me tilt colder. Not wind. Not weather. Just cold. Intentional cold. A cold that notices you. Watches you. Learns the shape of you. I backed away slowly. My boots sank into the frost as I moved, and each sound felt like I was interrupting someone. When I reached the path, I turned and kept walking. I didn't sprint, but my legs moved faster than they usually did. The rest of the morning passed uneventfully, but I returned to that spot again before leaving for the day. The soil was perfectly still. Untouched, calm, dead. But I had seen it breathe. And some things, once seen, don't let go of your mind. That night, I dreamed of footsteps moving under earth. Gentle, shuffling steps. Like someone pacing inside a small room. When I woke, my heart was pounding so hard I thought I might be having a heart attack. I checked the clock. 3:12 a.m. The cemetery hour. The hour when nothing alive should be stirring. I tried to sleep again, failed, and sat on the edge of the bed staring into nothing. I couldn't shake the rhythm from my head, the inhale, the exhale, the faint lift of the soil. By morning, I knew I had to return early, before anyone else arrived. And that's how the second day began. When I reached Marion Hartley's grave, something new had changed. The soil was slightly shifted. A tilt, not dramatic but noticeable. As if something underneath had turned in its sleep. The frost around the grave had melted again despite the cold. And there was a faint scent in the air, a sweetness I couldn't place. Not flowers. Not decay. Something between the two. I circled the grave slowly, not touching anything. I didn't want to disturb whatever rhythm the soil was following. And that's when I saw it. A footprint. Small, bare. Pressed into the frost on the backside of the grave. A footprint that had no business being there. Thin toes. A narrow arch. A woman's foot or a young girl's foot. No sock lines. No shoe tread. Perfect skin texture pressed into frozen grass. I crouched, heart thudding. The print had not been there yesterday. Someone barefoot had stood behind that grave sometime in the night. And the ground around it wasn't disturbed. No approach marks. No retreat marks. Just one single print. As if someone had stepped forward. Or stepped out. I looked back at the grave. The soil shivered, not lifted, not sank, just shivered. Like someone inside had exhaled a cold breath through the dirt. I stepped back so fast I nearly fell. My breath turned to fog in the air. The cemetery around me felt suddenly alert. Aware. Like I had walked into a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. I stayed a few steps back, watching the soil settle again. Whatever movement had rippled across it faded slowly, and the grave returned to that same impossible stillness I'd seen the afternoon before. I swallowed hard and tried to convince myself there had to be a logical explanation, something physical, a shifting pocket of air, settling ground, temperature differences. But no natural thing moves with intention, and that's what unsettled me the most. It wasn't the movement. It was the rhythm. The pattern felt too deliberate, too much like someone testing the surface of the world above them. As I turned to walk away, I saw something resting against the side of the stone. A piece of cloth. Pale. Folded. Not placed by weather or accident. I leaned down and lifted it carefully. It was a handkerchief, thin cotton, embroidered with small blue flowers. Old-fashioned. Clean, but worn at the edges, as if it had been held and washed many times. I had never seen it on the grounds before. And the frost under it was melted, as if someone warm had said it there minutes earlier. I checked the caretaker's log once I returned to the office. No visitors for that plot in months. No family request. No overnight entry. Nothing to explain the bare footprint, the melted frost, or the handkerchief that now sat on my desk like some quiet accusation. All day, something in me kept glancing toward the eastern corner, as if expecting movement through the window. Each time, I told myself I wouldn't go back until tomorrow. But as dusk crept in and shadows stretched wider, I knew I wasn't going to sleep unless I checked one more time. So just after closing, when the cemetery was empty and the air had a metallic stillness that comes right before night locks in, I made my way back through the rows. Every step felt louder than it should have. The sound bounced strangely in the cold air. When I reached Marion Hartley's grave again, the handkerchief was gone. I froze. Not dropped, not blown away, gone. The soil had a faint indentation on top, right in the center. Not a footprint. Not an animal. More like the weight of a small hand pressing gently against the earth. I stared at it for a long time, waiting for any movement, any shift, but the ground stayed perfectly still. I took a cautious step closer. That's when the voice came. It wasn't loud. It wasn't clear. It was barely sound at all, more like breath shaped into the idea of a word. But I heard it. A faint whisper rising through the soil, thin as thread. Stay. The word was drawn out, like someone speaking through cloth or stone. I stumbled back instinctively, pulse thudding in my ears. For a moment, I thought I imagined it. But then it came again, softer, almost ashamed of itself. Stay. The cemetery around me felt suddenly crowded, though nothing moved. The air thickened, as if the cold itself had weight. I forced myself to breathe, to remember that I was still above ground, still living, still in control. But my feet didn't lift from the spot. Some part of me felt rooted there, compelled. I found my voice eventually, shaky but real. What do you want? The breeze answered first, rustling the grass. Then the soil shifted, not rising, not breathing, just a subtle ripple, like a fingertip brushing under the surface. Help. A single word clearer than the first, full of longing. I don't understand, I whispered. The ground trembled softly, and a small patch of soil loosened, revealing something pale beneath. My breath caught in my chest. I knelt slowly, hands shaking, and brushed the dirt aside with the back of my glove. The handkerchief. The same one I had taken earlier. But now it was clutched around something, a small silver pendant shaped like a heart, tarnished and old. Inside the pendant was a faded photograph of two young women standing arm in arm beside a tree. One was smiling wide, the other shyly. I recognized the shy smile from the headstone photo nearby, one row over. Anna Hartley, Marion's sister. I checked the stone again just to be sure. Anna Hartley. 1939 to 2009. Loved beyond measure. Both sisters died the same year. Buried only yards apart. But not together. For a moment, everything made a kind of tragic, impossible sense. The breathing grave. The melted frost. The single footprint. The whispered plea. Someone was reaching out, not to frighten, but to be noticed. To be remembered. That night, under the last gray light, I carried the pendant across the grass and placed it at the base of Anna's grave. The moment it touched the soil, the air shifted around me. A soft warmth brushed my cheek, almost like a sigh. And in the distance, faint but unmistakable, I heard footsteps walking through leaves. Not menacing. Not lingering. Just leaving. Going somewhere they had waited too long to go. When I looked back at Marion's grave, the soil was perfectly still. No breath. No tremble. No plea. Just earth, settled and quiet, the way graves are meant to be. I reported none of this the next morning. Some things don't need paperwork. Some things simply need to be finished. A week later, as I passed the eastern corner during my rounds, I saw something new by the base of Marion's stone. A single fresh flower. Wild. Pink. No stem damage. No footprints leading to or from the grave. Just placed. Gently. Respectfully. And that's when I felt it, a sense of completion, like tension that had finally let go. The corner didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt lighter, like someone grateful had finally stopped waiting. Every now and then I still check that spot, out of habit more than fear. Nothing moves. Nothing breathes. The soil stays perfectly still. But sometimes, when the light is low and the mist hangs thin between the stones, I see a flicker of warmth near the Hartley sisters' graves, a brief shimmer like the passing of someone hand in hand with someone else. Not haunting, not warning, just a reunion that took too long. And whenever I see it, I stop, place my hand on the cold marble, and stand witness. Because sometimes that's all a soul needs, someone living to say, quietly and sincerely, I see you. You're not forgotten. And the world settles straight again. You have been listening to The Whispering Hour. Tonight's tale fades softly, leaving its last light in the quiet corners of your mind. Let the echoes settle. Let the darkness rest. Good night.